Before Hogwarts, there was blood and rust. Discover Severus Snape's dark American origin story and his violent, unstoppable path to avenging his broken family. Hit subscribe, drop a like, and comment below to claim your spot before we dive into the darkness. The sky over Spinner's End was never truly blue. It was a perpetual, bruised canvas of slate gray and sickly yellow, stained by the relentless belch of the steel mill's smokestacks down by the river. This was Pennsylvania in the late 1960s, a place where the American dream had come to rust, flake apart, and die on the cracked sidewalks. For 9-year-old Severus Snape, the suffocating smog outside was nothing compared to the suffocating terror inside his own home. Number 19, Spinner's End, was a rotting row house that leaned against its neighbors as if exhausted by its own existence. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of stale, cheap beer, damp wallpaper, and the metallic tang of unwashed copper pots. Severus sat huddled in the suffocating darkness of the narrow pantry beneath the stairs, his thin arms wrapped tightly around his knobby knees. He wore a flannel shirt 3 sizes too large, its frayed cuffs swallowing his pale, spider-like hands. Beyond the thin wooden door, the house vibrated with violence. "You're useless, Eileen, a goddamn parasite," the voice roared. It was the sound that belonged to a beast, not a man, though Tobias Snape was, tragically, just a man. A broad-shouldered, bitter mill worker who took out the humiliation of a dying industry and a shrinking paycheck on the only 2 people who couldn't fight back. Something shattered against the kitchen wall, a plate or perhaps a glass bottle. The crash was followed by a sharp, muffled cry. Severus clamped his hands over his ears, squeezing his eyes shut. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird, but he didn't cry. Crying was a weakness. Crying drew Tobias's attention. Crying got you a backhand that would leave your ears ringing for days. He focused on the roaches crawling along the baseboards in the dim light filtering through the door crack. They were survivors. They hid, they scurried, they endured. Severus had learned to be a cockroach in his own home. "Get out of my sight before I really give you something to whine about," Tobias bellowed, followed by the heavy, rhythmic thud of his steel-toed work boots stomping towards the living room. The springs of the worn-out recliner groaned as Tobias collapsed into it, and soon after, the muffled blare of a baseball game on the black-and-white television filled the house. Severus waited. He counted to 100 in his head. Then he counted to 100 again. Only when the gruff, wet snores of his father eclipsed the sound of the TV announcer did the boy finally push the pantry door open. The kitchen was a disaster zone of spilled beer, shattered ceramic, and overturned chairs. And there, kneeling on the yellowed linoleum floor, desperately trying to sweep up the shards with trembling, bruised hands, was his mother. Eileen Snape was a shadow of a woman, her sallow skin stretched tightly over prominent cheekbones, and her dark, heavy hair hung in greasy curtains around her face, mirroring her son's. As Severus crept into the kitchen, she flinched, instinctively raising an arm to guard her face. "It's just me, Mom," whispered Severus, his voice raspy from disuse. Eileen let out a ragged breath and lowered her arm, though her dark eyes remained wide and haunted. "Sev, I told you to stay hidden." "He's asleep." Severus knelt beside her, his small hands carefully picking up the larger pieces of the broken plate. He noticed a fresh, angry welt forming along her jawline. A hot, acidic coil of hatred tightened in his stomach. "Leave it," Eileen muttered, her voice entirely devoid of life. She pushed herself up from the floor, leaning heavily against the cheap Formica counter. "Just leave it. Come upstairs." Severus followed her up the narrow, creaking staircase, stepping carefully over the 5th step that always whined loud enough to wake the dead, or worse, his father. They bypassed his tiny, drafty bedroom and went straight to their parents' room at the end of the hall. Eileen locked the door behind them, a flimsy defense against a man who could kick it off its hinges, but a necessary psychological barrier. She walked over to the closet and pulled back the moth-eaten clothes hanging inside. Severus watched in silence as she dropped to her knees and wedged her henders beneath a loose floorboard, pulling it up with a sharp groan of old wood. From the cavity beneath the floor, she hoisted up an old, heavy wooden box bound in tarnished brass. It looked ancient, completely out of place in the cheap, rotting row house. "Mom?" asked Severus, stepping closer. Eileen didn't look at him. She traced the intricate crest carved on the lid, 2 crossed wands over a shield flanked by serpents. "I wasn't always this, Severus," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I wasn't always nothing." She unlatched the box. The smell of old parchment, dried lavender, and something electric and ozone-like, like the air right before a thunderstorm, wafted out. Severus leaned in, his black eyes widening. Inside sat a beautiful emerald-green velvet robe, utterly pristine. Beneath it lay heavy, leather-bound books with titles stamped in gold foil that he couldn't read. Glass vials shimmering with silver dust, and resting at the very top a long, slender piece of polished black wood. "Is that?" Severus asked, reaching out, but hesitating, looking to his mother for permission. "A wand," Eileen answered, a bitter tear finally spilling over her bruised cheek. "Ebony, dragon heartstring, 14 inches, unyielding." She let out a dry, humorless laugh. Or so it was supposed to be. You have magic?" Severus breathed, staring at the stick. He remembered the strange things that sometimes happened when he was angry or scared, books flying off shelves, Tobias tripping over thin air, the pantry lock clicking shut on its own. He had always known he was different, but he thought he was a freak. "I am a witch," Eileen said, looking him dead in the eye, a brief, tragic flicker of pride illuminating her hollow face. "And you, Severus, you have it too. I've seen it." Severus stared at the wand, then at the welt on his mother's face. The revelation crashed over him not with wonder, but with a sickening confusion. "If you have magic," Severus asked, his voice hardening, dropping an octave with sudden, cold clarity, "why do you let him hit you?" The question hung in the air, heavy and lethal. Eileen flinched as if struck again. She slammed the lid of the brass box shut, the metallic clack echoing loudly in the cramped bedroom. "You don't understand," she hissed, her eyes darting to the locked door. "Magic isn't a cure-all, Severus. There are laws. The ministry in Britain, Makusa here, they track underage magic. They track everything. When I married a Muggle, a non-magical, my family disowned me. I had nothing, no money, no support. If I used magic against him, they'll snap my wand. They'll take you away. I have nowhere to go." She buried her face in her hands, her narrow shoulders shaking with silent, pathetic sobs. "I gave it all up for a man I thought loved me, for a normal life in America." Severus stood perfectly still, staring at the broken woman sobbing on the floor. A normal life? Was this what normal was? Poverty, bruises, and hiding in the dark? He looked at the floorboards where the box of miracles was hidden, buried like a corpse. His mother was a witch. She had the power to bend reality, to conjure fire, to break bones with a single word. Yet she chose to let a drunken, mundane brute treat her like a dog. Disgust, cold and sharp as a razor, sliced through Severus's chest. He didn't feel pity for her anymore. He felt a profound, horrifying contempt. She was weak. She had blood that was ancient and powerful, the blood of the prince family, and she had let it be infected and dominated by the lowest form of Muggle filth. Severus backed away from her, his hands clenching into tight, trembling fists at his sides. He felt a strange tingling in his fingertips, a buzzing static electricity that made the hairs on his arms stand up. The single light bulb hanging from the ceiling suddenly flickered and flared with a blinding brightness, buzzing angrily like a trapped wasp. Eileen gasped, looking up at the bulb, then at her son. "Sev, calm down! Don't let it out! Not here!" But Severus wasn't listening. His dark eyes were fixed on the locked door, beyond which the beast slumbered in his armchair. He made a silent vow in that suffocating room, a vow sealed with the bitter iron taste of his own bitten tongue. He would never be like her. He would never suppress what he was. He was a prince, even if his blood was half tainted by the monster downstairs. He would take that magic. He would learn every dark, terrible secret hidden in those leather-bound books, and he would become so powerful that no one, not his father, not the laws, not the whole rotting Muggle world, would ever lay a hand on him again. He would make Tobias Snape pay for every bruise, for every shattered plate, for the squalor he had trapped them in. He would be the half-blood prince, and his reign would be one of absolute, unyielding vengeance. Without another word to his weeping mother, Severus turned and unlocked the door, slipping back out into the dim hallway. He didn't hide in the pantry this time. He walked silently past the living room, glaring at the snoring form of his father with a look of pure, unadulterated venom, and slipped out the back door into the smog-choked afternoon. To escape the house, Severus often wandered the labyrinth of decaying infrastructure that made up his side of town. He walked along the rusted railroad tracks where the freight trains used to haul coal and steel, his worn-out sneakers crunching against the gravel. He kept his head down, an oversized black coat dragging around his knees, making him look like a sickly bat fluttering through the industrial ruins. He hated this town. He hated the loud, boorish children who played stickball in the streets, calling him Snivelus and throwing rocks at him because his clothes were dirty and his hair was unwashed. He hated the Muggles. That was the word his mother had used, Muggles. It sounded perfectly stupid, a fitting title for the ignorant, cruel masses who lacked the divine spark he carried inside him. His wandering led him to a small, neglected playground bordered by a rusting chain-link fence. It was an ugly patch of cracked asphalt and overgrown weeds, featuring a swing set that groaned in the wind and a seesaw with peeling red paint. Severus usually avoided it when other children were there, preferring the solitude of the riverbank, but today something caught his eye. 2 girls were in the park. One was tall, thin, and horse-faced, sitting rigidly on a swing, looking utterly bored and disapproving of her surroundings. But the other girl was a stark contrast to the gray, dying world of Spinner's End. She had bright, fiery red hair that seemed to catch the meager sunlight filtering through the smog, and eyes as brilliantly green as a polished emerald. She was swinging, but not in the ordinary way. Severus pressed himself against the rusted chain link, his fingers curling into the diamond-shaped wire, and watched. The red-haired girl pumped her legs, going higher and higher until the swing's chains went slack. Then, at the apex of her arc, she let go. Severus's breath hitched. She was going to fall and break her neck on the asphalt. But she didn't fall. For a split second she seemed hung suspended in the air, defying gravity, before drifting down as slowly and gently as a dandelion seed, landing on her feet with a soft, impossible grace. The horse-faced girl shrieked, "Lily, don't do it! Mommy told you not to!" "I'm fine, Toonie," the red-haired girl, Lily, laughed, a sound like silver bells in a junkyard. She bent down and picked up a wilted brown flower growing through a crack in the pavement. She closed her hand over it, concentrated, and when she opened her palm, the flower was vibrant, alive, its petals a brilliant, glowing yellow. Severus stared, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The magic hummed in the air, recognizing its own. He wasn't the only one. Right here in this miserable, rusted town was another of his kind. He watched her with an intensity that bordered on obsession. She was light where he was dark. She was joy where he was rage. But she was a witch. She belonged to his world, the world of the prince family, the world of power. As he stared at her, a new, calculating thought formed in his young mind. He needed an ally. He couldn't conquer this world alone. If he was to master the magic his mother abandoned, if he was to rise above the filth of the Muggles, he needed someone who understood. He needed Lily. He would claim her friendship, pull her away from her mundane sister, and together they would be untouchable. He waited until the horse-faced sister, Petunia, turned her back to adjust the strap of her pristine, thoroughly unmagical saddle shoes. Severus slipped through a gap in the bent chain-link fence, moving as silently as a shadow. He didn't want to startle her, but social grace was a foreign language to a boy raised on screams and shattered glass. He stepped out from behind a large graffiti-covered oak tree, directly into Lily's path. "I know what you are," Severus said. His voice was too loud, too intense, carrying a desperate, rough edge. Lily gasped, dropping the yellow flower she had just revived. She stumbled backward, her brilliant green eyes wide with alarm. "What?" she stammered, looking him up and down. His appearance was jarring, the oversized, threadbare coat, the pale, hollow face framed by lank black hair, the intense, almost manic stare. "I know what you are," Severus repeated, taking a step closer. He felt a desperate urgency to make her understand, to bind her to him with the truth. You're a witch." Lily's face flushed a deep crimson, matching her hair. "That's a terrible thing to say to someone," she snapped, her alarm quickly shifting to indignation. She turned on her heel, shouting over her shoulder, "Come on, Toonie, let's go home. There's a weird boy here." Petunia, hearing the commotion, marched over. She took one look at Severus's ragged clothes and let out a scoff of pure, concentrated disdain. "Stay away from us, you dirty little creep," she spat, grabbing Lily's arm. Severus felt the familiar spike of hot, violent anger. Petunia looked at him exactly the way his father did. She was a Muggle. She was nothing. "I wasn't talking to you, Muggle," Severus sneered, the word slipping off his tongue with a venomous satisfaction he hadn't known he possessed. "What did you call me?" Petunia demanded. "I said you're a witch," Severus said, ignoring Petunia and locking his dark, bottomless eyes on Lily. "I saw what you did with the swing, and the flower. It's not a bad thing, it's magic. My mom is one, and I'm a wizard. We have magic." Lily stopped trying to pull away from Petunia. She looked back at Severus, her anger faltering, replaced by a deep, hungry curiosity. The word magic hung between them, a secret, forbidden bridge. "Magic isn't real," Petunia scoffed, though her voice wavered slightly. She tugged harder. "Lily, come on." "Wait," Lily said softly, pulling her arm free. She took a tentative step back toward Severus. You can do things too, like making things float?" Severus nodded eagerly, a rare, awkward smile twitching at the corners of his mouth. "Yes, and I know about the schools. There's a school for us, for people like us, not like her." He shot a glaring, dismissive look at Petunia. Lily looked from Severus to her sister, conflicted. Severus could see the battle in her green eyes, the loyalty to her ordinary family fighting against the undeniable magnetic pull of her true nature. "Tell me," Lily said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Tell me everything you know." Severus's heart soared. He had done it. He had breached the wall. As he began to tell her about the wands, the spells, and the hidden world his mother had wept over, he didn't just see a friend, he saw the foundation of his new life. He would teach her, he would protect her from the Muggles who would never understand her, and in return, she would never look at him with the disgust his father showed him. They stood in the decaying American park, a bright blossom and a dark shadow, forging a bond that would ultimately consume them both. Severus Snape had found his sanctuary, and he would destroy anyone who tried to take it from him. Summer in the Pennsylvania Rust Belt was not a season of leisure, it was a physical wait. The July heat trapped the sulfurous smog from the steel mills beneath a dome of humidity, turning the air thick, yellow, and suffocating. For Severus, the heat only made the cramped rowhouse at Spinner's End more intolerable, amplifying the stench of his father's stale beer and the sour sweat of unwashed laundry. His only escape was the small, patchy grove of trees near the river, the designated sanctuary where he met Lily. Over the past few weeks, their meetings had become the singular axis on which his world spun. He lived for the moments he could regale her with tales of Azkaban, the Ministry, and the hidden magical world that awaited them. Lily drank in the information like a dying plant absorbing rain, her bright green eyes wide with wonder. But there was a persistent rot in their sanctuary, Petunia. On a blisteringly hot Tuesday afternoon, Severus and Lily sat cross-legged on a patch of dry, yellowed grass hidden behind a rusted-out Ford pickup truck that had been abandoned near the riverbank. A sharp snap of a twig broke the spell. "I knew it! I knew you were sneaking off to see him!" Severus flinched, his hand instinctively balling into a fist. He looked up to see Petunia Evans standing a few feet away, her hands on her hips. She was wearing a crisp, pale pink sundress that looked obscenely clean against the backdrop of the rusted car and the muddy river. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a neat, severe ponytail. "Toonie, go away!" Lily scrambled to her feet, her face flushing. "You followed me!" "Mom and Dad told you not to play down here. It's dirty," Petunia snapped, her pale eyes drifting over to Severus with an expression of profound nausea. She looked at his oversized, frayed black shirt, the dirt permanently lodged beneath his fingernails, and the way his greasy hair clung to his sallow cheeks. "Shut up, Petunia," Lily shouted, stepping between them. But Severus didn't hide. He stood up slowly, brushing the dust from his knees. The look of disgust on Petunia's face was not new to him. It was the exact same look his father gave him when he failed to fetch a beer fast enough. It was the look the local shopkeepers gave his mother when she couldn't afford a loaf of bread. It was the universal, sneering face of the Muggle world, judging him for things beyond his control, completely oblivious to the ancient, powerful blood running through his veins. "I wasn't talking to you, Muggle," Severus sneered, the word slipping off his tongue with a venomous satisfaction he hadn't known he possessed. "What did you call me?" Petunia demanded. "I said you're a witch," Severus said, ignoring Petunia and locking his dark, bottomless eyes on Lily. "I saw what you did with the swing, and the flower. It's not a bad thing, it's magic. My mom is one, and I'm a wizard. We have magic." Lily stopped trying to pull away from Petunia. She looked back at Severus, her anger faltering, replaced by a deep, hungry curiosity. The word magic hung between them, a secret, forbidden bridge. "Magic isn't real," Petunia scoffed, though her voice wavered slightly. She tugged harder. "Lily, come on." "Wait," Lily said softly, pulling her arm free. She took a tentative step back toward Severus. You can do things too? Like making things float?" Severus nodded eagerly, a rare, awkward smile twitching at the corners of his mouth. "Yes, and I know about the schools. There's a school for us, for people like us, not like her." He shot a glaring, dismissive look at Petunia. Lily looked from Severus to her sister, conflicted. Severus could see the battle in her green eyes, the loyalty to her ordinary family fighting against the undeniable magnetic pull of her true nature. "Tell me," Lily said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Tell me everything you know." Severus's heart soared. He had done it. He had breached the wall. As he began to tell her about the wands, the spells, and the hidden world his mother had wept over, he didn't just see a friend, he saw the foundation of his new life. He would teach her, he would protect her from the Muggles who would never understand her, and in return, she would never look at him with the disgust his father showed him. They stood in the decaying American park, a bright blossom and a dark shadow, forging a bond that would ultimately consume them both.
Severus Snape had found his sanctuary, and he would destroy anyone who tried to take it from him.
The house was eerily silent when Severus slipped through the back door. It was well past midnight. The only sound was the distant, rhythmic thumping of a freight train and the heavy, wet snoring of Tobias Snape, who had passed out on the living room sofa, one hand draped over an empty bottle of cheap bourbon. Severus bypassed the kitchen and crept up the creaking stairs, moving with the practiced silence of a ghost. His mother was asleep in the upstairs bedroom, exhausted from a double shift she had secretly taken at a local diner to pay for groceries. He didn't go to his own room. Instead, he pulled down the rickety wooden ladder that led to the small, unfinished attic space above the hallway. It was meant for storage, but Tobias never went up there, claiming it was full of rats and asbestos. A week ago, Severus had discovered that his mother had moved her brass box from under the floorboards to this dusty, forgotten crawlspace. He climbed the ladder, the air growing stiflingly hot and smelling of dry rot and dead wasps. He pulled a small, stolen flashlight from his pocket and clicked it on. The beam cut through the thick dust motes dancing in the air, landing on the tarnished brass box tucked behind a pile of old, moldy cardboard boxes. Severus knelt beside it, his heart beating a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He unlatched the box. The velvet robes and the ebony wand lay untouched, but his eyes went straight to the heavy, leather-bound books. He pulled one out. The title, embossed in faded gold, read, "A Compendium of Hexes, Jinxes, and Minor Curses." He sat cross-legged on the rough wooden floorboards, balancing the hefty tome on his lap, and opened it. The pages were thick parchment, filled with dense, elegant handwriting and ink illustrations of wizards waving wands in sharp, aggressive arcs. Severus devoured the text. While other children his age were reading comic books about superheroes, Severus was memorizing incantations meant to trip, sting, blind, and paralyze. He read about the theory of intent, how magic was not just words, but the channeling of raw emotion. To cast a hex, the book explained, one had to truly desire the effect. One had to marshal their anger, their spite, and their will, and force it into the physical world. Desire the effect. Severus closed his eyes, thinking of his father's heavy fists. He thought of Petunia's cruel, mocking laugh. He thought of his mother, broken and weeping on the linoleum floor, her ancient bloodline squandered on a man who treated her like trash. Anger, pure and absolute, flared in his chest like a lit match dropped in gasoline. He raised his hand, pointing his index finger at a dead, desiccated rat lying in the corner of the attic. He didn't have a wand, but he remembered his mother saying that powerful wizards could channel magic wandlessly if their will was strong enough. He focused all his hatred, all his desire for revenge against the world that had kept him small and afraid, and whispered the incantation he had just memorized. Everte statum. A sharp, crackling sound, like a miniature whip, snapped in the quiet attic. The dead rat was violently thrown backward, slamming against the wooden rafters with a dull thud before falling back to the floor in a cloud of dust. Severus lowered his hand, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. He looked at his trembling fingers. The static charge was gone, replaced by an intoxicating, rushing warmth. He felt powerful. He felt dangerous. The dark arts were not just spells in a book. They were his equalizer. They were the weapons he would use to carve his way out of Spinner's End, to protect Lily, and to make the Muggle world regret ever looking down on him. He stayed in the attic until dawn, reading by the dim light of the flashlight, whispering curses into the dark. The tension between Severus, Lily, and Petunia finally snapped in a humid afternoon in late August. Severus and Lily were walking along the overgrown path near the abandoned train tracks, discussing the impending arrival of their Hogwarts letters.
Severus had assured her that the owls would find them, even in America, thanks to international magical agreements his mother had vaguely mentioned. "I can't wait to leave," Lily said, her eyes shining as she balanced on a rusted steel rail. "To go somewhere where things are beautiful, where magic is everywhere." "We'll be in Slytherin together," Severus said confidently, walking beside her. "It's the best house. It's for people who are destined for greatness." "Lily!" The shrill voice cut through the idyllic moment. Petunia was marching down the embankment, her face red with exertion and fury. She had followed them again. "I told you to stop seeing him," Petunia shrieked, tripping over a discarded tire but catching herself. "Mum is looking for you. If she finds out you're down here with this trash, she's going to ground you forever." Lily stopped balancing on the rail and sighed, looking genuinely exhausted. "Toonie, just leave us alone, please." "No!" Petunia marched right up to them. She glared at Severus, her pale eyes filled with a vicious, venomous hatred that looked entirely out of place on a young girl. "You think you're so special with your little magic tricks. You're not. You're just a freak, a poor, dirty freak from a broken home. You'll never be anything but trash, Severus Snape." The words hit him like stones, but unlike before, Severus didn't shrink away. The hours he had spent in the attic, absorbing the dark theory of hexes, had changed him. His anger was no longer a wild, uncontrollable panic. It was a focused, lethal weapon. He stared at Petunia. He didn't see a child. He saw the embodiment of the Muggle world that tortured his mother. He saw the arrogance of the mundane. Desire the effect. Severus didn't pull a wand. He didn't say an incantation aloud. He simply stared at the heavy, dead, rotting branch of an oak tree hanging directly above Petunia's head. He focused all his rage, all his humiliation, and all his burgeoning power onto the joint where the dead wood met the trunk. Snap! It sounded like a gunshot. Petunia looked up just in time to scream as the heavy branch plummeted. It didn't hit her squarely on the head, thankfully, or it might have killed her, but it clipped her shoulder hard, sending her sprawling onto the gravel. The sharp twigs scratched her face, drawing a thin line of bright red blood across her cheek. "Lily!" screamed in absolute terror. She dropped to her knees beside her sister, hands hovering over the bleeding scratch. Petunia was wailing, a high-pitched, hysterical sound of pain and shock. Lily whipped her head around to look at Severus. Her green eyes were wide, but this time the wonder was gone. It was replaced by a deep, primal fear. She had seen him staring at the branch. She had felt the sudden, unnatural cold in the air. "You did that," Lily whispered, her voice trembling. "You made it fall." Severus stood perfectly still. For a brief, terrifying second, a wave of dark, pure satisfaction washed over him. He had hurt her. He had struck back. He had proven his superiority. But as he looked at Lily's horrified face, panic set in. He was losing his sanctuary. "No," Severus lied smoothly, stepping forward. "It was an accident, Lily. The branch was dead. Look at it. It just fell." "Don't come near us," Petunia sobbed, scrambling backward on the gravel like a crab, clutching her shoulder. "He's a monster, Lily. He's a freak." Lily didn't argue this time. She helped her sister to her feet, keeping her body positioned between Petunia and Severus. She looked at him one last time, a look of profound betrayal and confusion, before turning and half carrying, half dragging her crying sister back up the embankment. Severus stood alone on the rusted tracks. The satisfaction was entirely gone, replaced by a cold, hollow ache. He had protected their secret, he had punished the Muggle, but the look in Lily's eyes burned him. He realized then that power had a cost, but as he looked up at the jagged stump of the branch he had severed with his mind alone, he decided it was a cost he was willing to pay.
The summer dragged on, suffocating and tense. Lily had avoided him since the incident by the tracks. Severus spent his days locked in the stifling attic, diving deeper into his mother's old textbooks, memorizing curses, shielding charms, and potions theory. He was preparing for war. It happened on a Friday evening. The heat wave had finally broken, replaced by a violent thunderstorm that rattled the thin windows of Spinner's End. Severus had risked bringing one of the spill books down to his bedroom, assuming his father was passed out at the local pub. He sat on his narrow, lumpy mattress, tracing the intricate wand movements for a localized freezing charm, completely absorbed in the theory. The front door slammed downstairs, the sound echoing over a crack of thunder. Severus froze. Heavy, uneven footsteps stomped across the living room floor, followed by the sound of a chair being violently kicked over. Tobias was home, and he was violently drunk. "Eileen?" Tobias bellowed, his voice thick and slurred. "Where is my goddamn dinner?" Severus heard his mother's frantic, whispering voice trying to soothe him, followed by the sickening, wet sound of a slap. In the past, Severus would have hidden under his bed, clamped his hands over his ears, and counted to 100. But tonight was different. Tonight, the magic hummed in his veins, hot and demanding. He looked down at the dark leather book in his lap. He was a prince. He was a wizard. Severus closed the book, slid it under his mattress, and stood up. He walked out of his room and stood at the top of the stairs, looking down into the dim hallway. Tobias was standing over Eileen, who was cowering against the peeling wallpaper, clutching her cheek. Tobias raised his heavy, calloused fist again. "Stop." The voice was quiet, but it cut through the sound of the rain and Tobias's drunken panting. Tobias slowly turned his head, his bloodshot eyes narrowing as he looked up the staircase at his son. "What did you say to me, you little rat?" Tobias snarled, leaving Eileen and taking a heavy, menacing step toward the stairs. "I said, stop touching her," Severus repeated. He walked down the stairs, his movements deliberate and completely devoid of fear. He stopped 3 steps from the bottom, so he was perfectly at eye level with his towering, broad-shouldered father. Tobias let out a cruel, barking laugh. "Look at the little freak trying to be a man. Get back to your room before I give you what your mother just got." Tobias lunged, his massive hand reaching out to grab Severus by the collar of his frayed shirt. Severus didn't flinch. He didn't cower. He stared directly into his father's bloodshot eyes, channeling every ounce of hatred, every night spent crying in the pantry, every bruise his mother had tried to hide with makeup. He threw his right hand forward, palm open, and unleashed a kinetic shockwave of raw, unadulterated magical force. It wasn't an elegant spell, it was a sledgehammer of pure intent. The invisible force slammed into Tobias's chest with the impact of a speeding truck. The massive man was lifted entirely off his feet. He flew backward through the air, crashing violently against the opposite wall. The plaster cracked under the impact, and the cheap wooden coat rack splintered into pieces as Tobias collapsed onto the floor in a heap of groaning, wheezing limbs. Eileen screamed, pressing her hands over her mouth in absolute terror. Tobias rolled onto his side, coughing violently, struggling to catch his breath. He looked up at Severus. The drunken rage in the man's eyes was gone. In its place was something Severus had never seen before. Absolute, paralyzing terror. He was looking at his son not as a punching bag, but as a monster. Severus slowly walked down the final 3 stairs. He stood over his father, his pale face an unreadable mask, his dark eyes glinting in the dim light. The power coursing through him was euphoric. He could crush this man. He could shatter his ribs with a thought. "If you ever lay a hand on her again," Severus said, his voice a lethal, silken whisper that seemed too old for a boy of 11, "I won't just throw you into a wall. I will stop your heart from beating." He turned on his heel, stepping over his father's trembling legs, and walked back up the stairs, leaving the broken Muggle and the weeping witch behind him. The dynamic of Spinner's End had irrevocably shifted. The prey had become the predator. It arrived 2 days later.
The sky over Spinner's End was particularly grim that morning, choked with a yellow-brown smog that tasted like copper pennies. Severus was sitting at the kitchen table, silently eating a bowl of stale cereal. Across the table, Tobias sat rigidly, refusing to look at his son, his eyes glued to the newspaper, a nasty purple bruise peeking from beneath his shirt collar. Eileen was washing dishes, the silence in the kitchen thick as you could cut it with a knife. Suddenly, a loud, sharp tapping sound came from the kitchen window. They all jumped. Severus turned. Sitting on the windowsill, looking utterly ridiculous against the backdrop of the dying Pennsylvania steel town, was a large, magnificent barn owl. In its beak, it held a thick envelope made of yellowish parchment. "What in God's name?" Tobias muttered, dropping his newspaper, his face paling. He looked at the bird, then at Eileen. "What is this? Is this your freak shit, Eileen?" Eileen dried her hands on her apron, her hands trembling. It's a letter, Tobias, a school letter." Severus stood up. His heart was hammering, a wild, victorious drumbeat. He walked toward the window and unlatched it. The owl hopped inside, dropped the heavy envelope onto the kitchen table, ruffled its feathers disdainfully at the smell of the house, and immediately took flight, vanishing back into the smog. Severus reached for the letter. The address was written in emerald green ink. Mr. S. Snape, the smallest bedroom, 19 Spinner's End, Cokeworth, Pennsylvania, USA. Tobias slammed his hand down on the table, barely missing the envelope. "He's not going. I'm not having a son of mine going to some freak school to learn how to do whatever the hell you did to me." "Tobias, please," Eileen begged, her voice barely a whisper. "It's paid for. There's a fund for our kind." "I said no!" Tobias roared, his fear temporarily overridden by his need to assert control over his own house. He lunged across the table, grabbing the parchment envelope. "I'm burning this. You're going to a normal public school, and you're going to learn a trade, and you're going to stop this unnatural nonsense." He turned toward the gas stove, reaching for a box of matches. Severus didn't panic. He didn't shout. He simply raised his hand. "Immobilis," Severus whispered, executing the incantation he had practiced perfectly in the attic. It was a staggering feat of wandless magic, born purely from his absolute refusal to be trapped in this town for another day. A sudden crackling wave of blue energy shot from Severus's fingertips. It struck Tobias squarely in the back. The massive man froze instantly, his muscles locked up, turning him as rigid as a statue mid-stride. The box of matches slipped from his paralyzed fingers and clattered onto the linoleum. Tobias let out a muffled, strangled groan. He could breathe, he could see, but he couldn't move an inch. Eileen screamed, pressing her hands over her mouth in absolute terror. Severus calmly walked over to his frozen father. He reached out and effortlessly pried the parchment envelope from his stiff, unyielding grip. He looked into his father's eyes. They were wide, darting frantically, filled with an abject, humiliating terror. "You don't make the rules anymore," Severus said, his voice devoid of anger, entirely calm and clinical. "You are nothing. I am leaving this house. I am going to learn everything there is to know about magic, and when I am done, if you ever try to stop me or hurt my mother again, I will ensure you spend the rest of your pathetic life trapped exactly like this." Severus broke the wax seal, which bore a crest of a lion, an eagle, a badger, and a snake. He pulled out the heavy parchment and read the first line, "Dear Mr. Snape, we are pleased to inform you that you have been accepted at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry." Severus folded the letter and put it in his pocket. He snapped his fingers, and the freezing charm broke. Tobias collapsed onto the kitchen floor, gasping for air, trembling violently, a broken, defeated man. Severus didn't look down at him. He looked at his mother. "Pack my things," he commanded. "We need to go to London to get my supplies." He turned and walked out of the kitchen, ready to leave the rust, the blood, and the weakness behind forever. The prince was finally going home.
The transition from the rusted, dying heart of Pennsylvania to the hidden, magical center of London was jarring, achieved through a ministry-sanctioned transatlantic portkey, an old rusted hubcap located in a Macusa outpost in New York. When Severus and his mother landed in the damp cobblestone alleyway behind the leaky cauldron, his stomach heaved, but his eyes were wide, absorbing every impossible detail. Diagon Alley was a sensory explosion. Crooked shops leaned over the street, their windows displaying shimmering cauldrons, jars of preserved grotesque organs, and broomsticks that hovered effortlessly behind glass. It was everything his mother's old books had promised, and more. But as the initial awe subsided, a familiar, bitter reality began to set in. Magic, it turned out, did not erase poverty. Eileen clutched a small velvet pouch containing the meager Hogwarts financial aid fund allotted for impoverished students. They navigated the bustling street like ghosts, dodging cheerful, well-fed families. Severus wore his oversized Muggle coat to hide his threadbare clothes, but he could feel the eyes of the magical elite lingering on them with casual disdain. In Madame Malkin's robes for all occasions, the disparity became agonizing. Severus stood on a stool, being fitted for second-hand, slightly frayed black work robes, while on the stool next to him stood a boy with sleek, pale blonde hair. The boy was being measured for robes of fine acromantula silk. "Going to Hogwarts, too?" the blonde boy drawled, eyeing Severus's worn Muggle sneakers with a perfectly practiced sneer. "Lucius Malfoy. Slytherin, obviously. My father is just next door buying my books. New editions, of course. I can't imagine wearing someone else's cast-offs." Severus's jaw tightened. He recognized the look. It was Petunia's look. It was the look of the privileged staring down at the dirt. But this wasn't a Muggle. This was a pureblood. Severus realized in that moment that escaping his father's world hadn't solved the problem. It had merely changed the arena. The magical world had its own royalty, and his mother, by marrying Tobias Snape, had thrown away her crown. When they left the shop, Severus watched the Malfoy families stride down the alley, parting the crowds with their mere presence. They possessed wealth, confidence, and unyielding power. "The Prince family used to walk like that," Eileen murmured, noticing his stare, her voice laced with a pathetic, hollow grief. "Before I ruined it." Severus didn't offer her comfort. He looked at his own reflection in the dark glass of an apothecary window. Pale face, dark eyes, second-hand clothes. He was half Muggle, carrying the taint of Tobias Snape, but he also carried the ancient, potent blood of the princes. He would not be a bottom feeder in this new world. He would reclaim the respect his mother had squandered. He would learn their darkest magic, outsmart their brightest students, and take what was owed to him. He was not just Severus Snape, the poor boy from Spinner's End. He was the half-blood prince, and his reign was about to begin. They returned to Pennsylvania via Portkey to pack his trunk, preparing for the final journey back to London on the morning of September 1st. The atmosphere in number 19 Spinner's End was entirely transformed. The air no longer vibrated with the threat of Tobias's violence. Instead, it suffocated under a heavy, terrified silence. Severus stood in his tiny bedroom, snapping his battered, second-hand trunk shut. He wore his new black school robes over his Muggle clothes, a physical declaration of his true allegiance. He looked around the drafty, miserable room one last time. He felt no nostalgia, only a profound, liberating emptiness. He walked downstairs, the heavy trunk floating effortlessly a few inches behind him, levitated by a wandless charm he had spent the last 2 weeks perfecting. Tobias was sitting in his worn recliner. There was no television on. There was no beer bottle in his hand. He sat rigidly, his eyes fixed on the floorboards, his face pale and drawn. He hadn't spoken above a whisper since the incident in the kitchen.
Severus stopped in the center of the living room, letting the trunk drop to the floor with a heavy, deliberate thud. Tobias flinched visibly. "I am leaving," Severus said, his voice cold and flat. Tobias slowly looked up, his bloodshot eyes meeting his son's dark, bottomless stare. The man opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to offer a gruff goodbye, perhaps to assert some final semblance of fatherly authority, but the words died in his throat. "Do not think my absence is your freedom," Severus continued, stepping closer. The air in the room grew noticeably colder. "I have cast wards around this house. I will know if you lift a finger against her, and when I return next summer, I will be legally permitted to use a wand. If I find a single new bruise on my mother—" He didn't finish the threat. He didn't need to. He reached into his robe, his fingers brushing the smooth, polished wood of his mother's old ebony wand, which he had claimed as his own. Tobias swallowed hard, shrinking back into the upholstery, nodding frantically. Severus turned to his mother, who stood shivering by the kitchen door, clutching a dish towel. He gave her a sharp, curt nod. "I will write." He dragged his trunk out the front door, stepping onto the cracked asphalt of Spinner's End. The thick Pennsylvania smog felt different today. It felt like the ashes of a life he was leaving behind. Down the street, standing near the rusted chain-link fence, was Lily. She was wrestling with a large, heavy trunk of her own, her bright red hair tied back. Petunia was nowhere to be seen, likely sulking in her pristine bedroom. Lily looked up and saw him, her face breaking into a radiant, nervous smile. Severus walked towards her, leaving the shadow of his father's house for the last time. He had broken the Muggle who had terrorized him. Now he just had to conquer the rest of the world.
The international port key deposited them directly inside King's Cross Station in London. The transition from the muggy, industrial morning of America to the cool, bustling interior of the British train station made Lily dizzy, but Severus was sharp, vigilant, and completely focused. He guided Lily and her utterly bewildered Muggle parents toward the solid brick barrier between platforms 9 and 10. Mr. and Mrs. Evans looked terrified, clutching each other's hands as businessmen in sharp suits hurried past them, oblivious to the magical luggage carts they were pushing. "You just walk straight at the wall," Severus instructed, his voice low, enjoying the momentary authority he held over these clueless, ordinary adults. "Don't stop and don't be scared. It's an illusion." Lily took a deep breath, gripped the handle of her cart, and broke into a jog. She vanished seamlessly into the brick. Severus gestured impatiently for her parents to follow. Once they had nervously passed through, Severus took a running start and plunged into the barrier. The roar of a steam engine instantly replaced the sterile announcements of the Muggle station. A magnificent, gleaming, scarlet train sat at the platform, billowing thick white smoke into the air. A wrought iron sign overhead proudly declared, "Hogwarts Express, 11 o'clock." The platform was a sea of chaotic, vibrant magic. Owls hooted from stacked brass cages, cats of every color wove through the legs of the crowd, and students in dark robes embraced their parents, shouting goodbyes and exchanging last-minute galleons. "It's real," Lily breathed, standing frozen beside her cart, her green eyes wide with absolute awe. "It's all really real." Severus stood close to her, his dark eyes scanning the crowd. He was awestruck, yes, but he was also calculating. He noticed the family crests embroidered on some of the expensive trunks. He noted the confident, boisterous laughter of the older students, who moved with the assurance of people who owned the world. He was an outsider here, just as he was an outsider in Pennsylvania, but here he had the tools to change that. Mr. and Mrs. Evans were hugging Lily tightly, Mrs. Evans wiping tears from her eyes. "Oh, my brave girl. Write to us every week, do you hear? Promise me." "I will, Mum, I promise," Lily said, hugging her back. Severus stood a few paces away, entirely alone.
He watched the display of parental affection with a mixture of clinical curiosity and deep hidden resentment. His own mother hadn't hugged him goodbye. She had simply looked relieved that she wouldn't have to shield him from his father's wrath for 9 months. "Come on, Severus," Lily said, pulling away from her parents and grabbing her trunk. "We need to find a good compartment before they all fill up." Severus stepped forward to help her lift the heavy trunk onto the train. He cast a sideways glance at Mr. Evans, who offered him an awkward, tight-lipped nod. Severus ignored him, stepping aboard the scarlet train. He was leaving the Muggles behind. From this moment on, he was surrounded by magic, and he intended to master every single drop of it. The train's corridors were narrow and packed with students pushing and shoving, shouting over the hiss of the steam engine. Severus kept his head down, using his shoulder as a wedge to push through the crowd, making sure Lily stayed right behind him. He finally found an empty compartment near the back of the train and slid the heavy glass door shut, locking the chaos outside. "We did it," Lily laughed, collapsing onto the plush upholstered seat. She looked at him, her eyes shining with the shared secret of their escape. For a moment, the tension that had hung between them since the incident with the falling branch seemed to evaporate. They were just two outcasts who had finally found their way home. "I told you," Severus said, allowing a small, genuine smile to break through his usually guarded expression. "We're exactly where we're supposed to be." The train lurched violently, the whistle blowing a long, triumphant note, and they began to move, leaving the station behind. But their peaceful sanctuary was remarkably short-lived. Barely 10 minutes into the journey, the compartment door slid open with a loud, obnoxious clatter. 2 boys stumbled inside, laughing raucously about a dung bomb they had apparently set off down the hall. They stopped when they saw the compartment was occupied. "Mind if we sit here?" the first boy asked, although he was already dragging his expensive brass-bound leather trunk into the room. He had untidy black hair, hazel eyes hidden behind wire-rimmed glasses, and carried an aura of such intense, unbothered confidence that it made Severus's teeth grind instantly. "Everywhere else is full," the second boy added, tossing himself onto the seat opposite Lily with an elegant, careless grace. He had aristocratic features, casually elegant dark hair, and wore robes that looked remarkably expensive even by magical standards. Severus shrank back slightly into his seat, his dark eyes narrowing. He recognized their type instantly, even without knowing their names. They were the magical equivalent of the rich kids in Cokeworth who had thrown stones at him. They were the boys who had never known a day of hunger, a night of terror, or the crushing weight of being entirely powerless. They possessed the casual arrogance of purebloods who believed the world existed solely for their amusement. "I'm James," the boy with glasses said, offering a grin that managed to be both friendly and incredibly smug. "James Potter, and this is Sirius Black." Severus's breath hitched slightly. Black. Even in her outdated books, the noble and most ancient House of Black was legendary. They were the zenith of pureblood supremacy. And Potter, a famously wealthy, respectable lineage. These were exactly the kind of people who had cast her mother out. These were the families that sat in their massive manors, hoarding wealth and power, while Eileen Prince bled on a linoleum floor in Pennsylvania. "I'm Lily," she said, offering a polite but slightly reserved smile. "Lily Evans, and this is Severus." James looked at Severus. His hazel eyes swept over Severus's sallow face, his greasy, unwashed hair, and the obviously second-hand, slightly ill-fitting black robes. The friendly grin faltered for a fraction of a second, replaced by a microscopic twitch of dismissal. It was a subtle judgment, but to a boy raised on hyper-vigilance, it was as loud as a gunshot. A cold, familiar, and highly dangerous hatred ignited in Severus's chest. The battle lines were being drawn before they had even reached the castle.
"So," Sirius Black said, leaning back and crossing his arms behind his head, thoroughly bored by the silence that had fallen over the compartment, "what house are you hoping for? My whole family has been in Slytherin." He said the word Slytherin with a mixture of dread and profound disgust. "Blimey," James Potter said, dramatically shuddering and adjusting his glasses. "And I thought you seemed all right. If I'm in Slytherin, I think I'll leave on the next train. No offense, of course, but it's for slimy gits." James chuckled at his own joke, and Sirius offered a barking, agreeable laugh. Severus felt the blood rush to his face, hot and furious. Slytherin was the house of the princes. It was the house of power, of ambition, of those who didn't just inherit the world, but seized it. To hear this pampered, ignorant boy insult the one thing Severus had looked forward to was intolerable. "My mother was in Slytherin," Severus said, his voice quiet, sharp, and deadly. James stopped laughing. He looked at Severus, an amused, mocking glint entering his hazel eyes. "Really? Your mother? Well, who knows? Maybe they'll make an exception and put you somewhere decent. Where are you hoping to go, seeing as you're so defensive about the snakes?" "Slytherin," Severus snapped, leaning forward, his dark eyes locked onto James. "If you've got brains, which you clearly don't." Sirius barked a laugh again, this time pointing at Severus. "Ooh, touchy, isn't he? Where are you hoping to go, Jimmy?" "Gryffindor, where dwell the brave at heart, like your old man." James drew an invisible sword and mimed a heroic lunge. "Gryffindor, the only place worth being." He turned back to Severus, a nasty little smirk playing on his lips. "You know, if you'd rather be a dark, slimy snake, I suppose that suits you. You look like you haven't seen the sun in a decade. What did you say your name was? Snivelus?" The word hit Severus like a physical blow. Snivelus, the same cruel, mocking playground insult he had endured from the Muggles in Spinner's End. It was proof, undeniable and absolute, that this world was no different. James Potter was just another Tobias Snape, wearing a silk robe instead of a dirty flannel shirt. Severus stood up, his hand immediately diving into the deep pocket of his robes, his fingers wrapping around the smooth wood of his wand. He felt the dark magic humming beneath his skin, eager to be unleashed, eager to break the nose of this arrogant, wealthy brat. "Severus, no!" Lily said sharply, grabbing his wrist. She stood up, glaring fiercely at James and Sirius. "You two are being incredibly rude. Leave him alone." "We didn't do anything," James protested, raising his hands in mock surrender, though his eyes never left Severus, glittering with the thrill of a challenge. "Come on, Severus," Lily said, her voice tight with anger. She pulled her trunk toward the compartment door. "I don't want to sit with a pair of arrogant toe rags." Severus let her pull him toward the door, but he didn't look away from James Potter. He paused in the doorway, staring down the bespectacled boy who had just declared himself an enemy. Severus didn't yell. He didn't throw a hex, though his fingers burned with the desire to do so. Instead, he simply memorized James's face. He memorized the arrogant smile, the expensive glasses, and the utter lack of fear. "You think you own this world, Potter," Severus whispered, his voice so soft it was barely audible over the clacking of the train wheels, yet carrying a weight of venom that made even Sirius Black's smile falter. "Enjoy your bravery while it lasts." He turned and followed Lily down the corridor. As they walked away, Severus Snape made his second vow. He would not just survive Hogwarts, he would conquer it, and he would dedicate his life to destroying James Potter, tearing down his privilege, and proving that the half-blood prince was the true master of this magical world. The tracks were laid, and there was no turning back. Hogwarts Castle was not merely a school. To Severus Snape, it was a fortress. As the massive oak doors swung open and the first years were led into the great hall by a stern witch named Professor McGonagall, a collective gasp rippled through the crowd. The ceiling above them mirrored a clear, star-studded night sky, and thousands of candles floated mid-air, casting a warm, golden glow over 4 long tables laden with gleaming golden plates.
Severus did not gasp. He walked with his spine rigidly straight, his dark, impenetrable eyes cataloging every detail, analyzing the room like a general surveying a battlefield. He ignored the ghosts that swooped down from the rafters and the enchanted architecture. His focus was entirely on the power dynamics. He looked at the 4 tables. The students clad in red and gold, Gryffindor, were boisterous, laughing loudly, exuding an obnoxious, entitled confidence that instantly reminded him of the wealthy kids back in Pennsylvania who used to ride their shiny new bicycles past his rotting front porch. The blue and bronze table, Ravenclaw, sat observing, sharp-eyed and calculating. The yellow and black, Hufflepuff, looked soft, welcoming, and inherently weak. Then his gaze shifted to the far side of the hall, the Slytherin table, green and silver. There was no raucous cheering there. The Slytherins sat with a terrifying, refined composure. They were aristocratic, clad in perfectly tailored robes, their posture impeccable. They watched the terrified first-years with cold, evaluating stares. This was the house of his mother's ancestors. This was the house of the princes. It looked like a nest of vipers, yes, but it also looked like a throne room. This is where I belong, Severus thought, a fierce, protective thrill coursing through his veins. This is where I build my armor. He glanced to his left. Lily was walking a few paces away, her bright green eyes wide, her face illuminated by the candlelight. She looked breathtakingly beautiful, like a creature born of the magic itself. He needed her to see what he saw. He needed her to walk to that green and silver table with him, to form an impenetrable alliance against the boys on the train, against the Muggles they had left behind, against anyone who would ever try to make them feel small again. The procession halted at the front of the hall. Professor McGonagall placed a 4-legged stool on the raised platform and set a battered, ancient, patched wizard's hat on it. A rip near the brim opened like a mouth, and the hat began to sing. Severus tuned it out. He was waiting for the verdict.
"When I call your name, you will put on the hat and sit on the stool to be sorted," Professor McGonagall announced, unrolling a long scroll of parchment. "Black, Sirius." The boy from the train compartment swaggered up to the stool, a smirk playing on his aristocratic lips. The hat barely touched his dark hair before it roared, "Gryffindor!" A stunned silence fell over the Slytherin table, followed by uproarious cheers from the Gryffindors. Sirius hopped off the stool, looking entirely too pleased with his own rebellion, and jogged over to the red and gold table. Severus curled his lip in disgust. A blood traitor. A boy handed the keys to the kingdom who threw them away just to be different. A few names later, the moment Severus had been agonizing over arrived. Evans, Lily. Lily gave Severus a quick, nervous smile, a fleeting connection that made his heart stutter before stepping up to the stool. She sat down, the hat slipping over her bright red hair. Severus held his breath. He gripped the edge of his oversized sleeves, silently willing his magic to reach out, to influence the ancient artifact. Slytherin, send her to Slytherin. She is my ally. She is mine. The hat seemed to deliberate for several excruciating seconds. Then the rip opened wide. Gryffindor! The word echoed off the stone walls, but to Severus it sounded like a death knell. The red and gold table erupted in cheers. He watched, entirely paralyzed, as Lily took off the hat, her face flushed with relief and joy, and trotted over to the Gryffindor table. She took a seat directly across from Sirius Black, who offered her a high five. A cold, jagged fissure cracked open in Severus's chest. The sanctuary they had built in the smog-choked ruins of Hogwarts was breached. The bright, beautiful light he had tethered himself to had just been swallowed by the enemy camp. "Potter, James!" "Gryffindor!" the hat shouted almost instantly.
James strutted to the table, high-fiving Sirius and flashing a dazzling, arrogant smile at Lily, who actually smiled back. The heat of pure, concentrated fury replaced the cold in Severus's veins. He was shaking. "Snape! Severus!" He didn't walk. He glided. He felt the eyes of the hall on his second-hand robes, on his lank hair, but he didn't care. He sat on the stool and McGonagall dropped the hat onto his head. The brim slipped over his eyes, plunging him into darkness. "Ah," a dry, ancient voice echoed directly into his mind. "What a fascinatingly dark little mind we have here." "Put me in Slytherin," Severus thought back, his mental voice a snarling command. "Slytherin," the hat chuckled, a sound like dry leaves scraping on stone. "Are you sure? I see a great deal of pain. A Muggle father, a broken home in a rusted, dying land. I see the bruises you hide. There is a desire to prove yourself, yes, but there is also a profound, simmering rage. You want to punish them, don't you? The ones who looked down on you." "I want power," Severus corrected fiercely, remembering his father paralyzed on the linoleum floor. "I want to be untouchable." "Yes, you have the ambition, you have the cunning to survive the darkest of winters. But be warned, Severus Snape, the path of vengeance is a lonely one. It will consume everything you hold dear. Still, if you are certain—" "Slytherin!" the hat roared aloud to the hall. Severus pulled the hat off and handed it back to McGonagall. He did not look at the Gryffindor table. He walked straight towards the green and silver banners, his jaw set, his heart locked away in a vault of iron and ice. The Slytherin common room was located deep in the dungeons beneath the Black Lake. It was a long, low-ceilinged room with rough stone walls, illuminated by the eerie, green-tinged light filtering through the submerged windows. It was cold, damp, and smelled of ancient secrets. To Severus, it felt perfectly like home. But entering Slytherin did not grant him immediate immunity. If anything, it placed him in a much more dangerous, subtle war zone. On his first night in the first-year boys' dormitory, the hierarchy was established with brutal efficiency. There were 4 other boys in his room: Avery, Mulciber, Rosier, and Wilkes. All of them carried names that had been written into magical history books for centuries. As they unpacked their lavish, brass-bound trunks, Avery, a stocky boy with a cruel, flat face, kicked Severus's battered, second-hand trunk. It popped open, spilling a few of his mother's old, fraying robes and a pair of patched Muggle jeans onto the stone floor. Avery wrinkled his nose in exaggerated disgust. "What is this garbage? Does your family shop in the Muggle gutters, Snape?" Mulciber laughed, a wet, ugly sound. "He smells like a Muggle. Look at him. You sure the hat made a mistake? You don't belong in here with us." Severus slowly knelt down and picked up his jeans. He had spent his entire life being terrorized by a man twice his size. He had sworn upon discovering his magic that he would never be a victim again. These boys were purebloods, but they were pampered. They had never had to fight for their lives in the suffocating dark. Severus stood up. He didn't reach for his wand. He didn't need it for this. He locked his dark, abyssal eyes on Avery's. He channeled the memory of the falling branch, the static shock of the freezing charm. He let the raw, untamed hatred he held for the arrogant and the privileged flood his veins. "Do not ever touch my things again," Severus whispered. He flicked his wrist. It wasn't a standard first-year spell. It was a variation of a stinging hex he had modified in the sweltering attic back in Cokeworth. A sharp, invisible whip of kinetic energy lashed across the room and struck Avery squarely across the mouth. Avery let out a yelp of genuine agony, stumbling backward and clutching his face. Blood welled up, dripping from a deep, perfectly straight cut across his bottom lip. Mulciber and Rosier froze in absolute shock. First years were supposed to be barely able to levitate a feather, let alone execute wandless, non-verbal dark magic. The heavy oak door to the dormitory creaked open. Leaning casually against the doorframe was Lucius Malfoy, a shiny silver prefect badge pinned on his chest. He took in the scene, the bleeding Avery, the terrified roommates, and Severus standing perfectly still, his eyes blazing with dark, unapologetic malice. Malfoy didn't deduct points. He didn't scold. A slow, highly intrigued smile spread across his pale, pointed face. "Well, well," Malfoy drawled, stepping into the room. He looked at Severus with a new, appraising light. "It seems our new addition has some teeth. Blood status is important, Avery, but let this be a lesson. Power is the only currency that truly matters in this house." Malfoy patted Severus lightly on the shoulder, a gesture of profound patronage. "Keep that fire, Snape. The Dark Lord's cause is always looking for exceptional talent." Malfoy swept out of the room. Avery backed away, pressing a handkerchief to his bleeding lip, his eyes wide with fear. Severus turned back to his trunk and calmly packed away his clothes. He had drawn his first blood at Hogwarts, and in doing so, he had secured his place in the Serpent's den.
The months bled into winter, and the cold of the Scottish Highlands seeped into the castle stones. Severus excelled in his classes with a frightening, obsessive intensity. In potions, he was already correcting the textbook's instructions. In defense against the dark arts, his knowledge of hexes surpassed students 3 years his senior. But his brilliance isolated him further. The Slytherins respected his power, keeping a fearful distance, but they did not offer friendship. And Lily was slipping away. She was always surrounded by Gryffindors. She was bright, popular, and vibrant. Whenever Severus managed to corner her in the library to study, the tension between them was palpable. She hated the dark spells he practiced. He hated the new, arrogant friends she defended. Specifically, he hated James Potter. The rivalry between Snape and the boys who called themselves the Marauders had escalated from verbal jabs in the corridors to a vicious underground war. Potter and Black were brilliant, wealthy, and cruel. They targeted Severus relentlessly, hexing his bag to tear, tripping him on the staircases, and mocking his hygiene and his poverty loudly enough for the whole courtyard to hear. The breaking point arrived in late April under the pale, watery spring sun. Severus was crossing the main courtyard, his nose buried in an advanced book on curse-breaking, when a loud voice echoed across the cobblestones. "Oi, Snivelus!" Severus stopped. He slowly closed his book and turned. James Potter and Sirius Black were leaning against the fountain, their wands twirling casually in their fingers. A small crowd of Gryffindors and Ravenclaws had already gathered, anticipating a show. "I heard your robes are second-hand because your Muggle daddy drank away the family fortune," James taunted loudly, adjusting his glasses with a smirk. "Or is it true your mother just weaves them out of garbage?" The crowd snickered. Severus felt the blood roar in his ears. The insult to his mother, the mention of Tobias, it was too much. The carefully constructed dam inside his mind, the one that held back the roaring river of his American trauma, cracked wide open. James pointed his wand, clearly intending to cast a humiliating jinx to hang Severus upside down, a spell James had been practicing. But Severus was faster. He didn't bother with the school's approved dueling curriculum. He drew his mother's ebony wand, slashing it through the air like a knife, bypassing James' shield charm entirely. "Sicare," Severus hissed. It was a crude, unfinished prototype of a spell he had been inventing in the margins of his potions book, a spell designed to act like a physical blade.
A flash of violent purple light shot from Severus's wand. It struck James directly on the side of his face. The cracking sound of the spell hitting flesh echoed loudly in the sudden silence of the courtyard. James staggered backward, dropping his wand, his hands flying to his face. When he pulled his hands away, his fingers were coated in bright crimson blood. A deep, ugly gash had been sliced across his cheekbone, narrowly missing his eye. Sirius yelled in shock, raising his wand, but Professor Flitwick, who had been crossing the courtyard, shrieked and sprinted forward, throwing himself between the boys. "Detention! Both of you! My office immediately!" Flitwick squeaked, horrified by the sight of the blood. As Flitwick ushered a bleeding, stunned James towards the hospital wing, Severus stood completely still on the cobblestones. His breathing was heavy, his heart pounding a frantic, chaotic rhythm. The crowd was staring at him in absolute terror. He looked at the drops of James's blood staining the gray stone. A dark, terrifying, intoxicating wave of euphoria washed over him. He had done it. He had taken the untouchable golden boy of Gryffindor and made him bleed. He had proven that wealth and popularity meant nothing against raw, unyielding power. He realized then that the path to his revenge could not be fought with disarming charms and tickling hexes. To destroy the monsters of this world, he had to become a worse one. The end-of-year feast was a loud, triumphant affair. The great hall was decorated in red and gold banners to celebrate Gryffindor winning the House Cup. The noise was deafening, the air thick with the smell of roast beef and sugar. Severus sat at the far end of the Slytherin table, completely alone. His plate was empty. The dark green robes hung loosely on his thin frame. The shadows under his eyes were darker than they had been when he arrived in September. He slowly lifted his gaze and looked across the hall, through the sea of celebrating students, until he found her. Lily was sitting near the center of the Gryffindor table. She was radiant, laughing openly, a bright, beautiful flame amidst the red and gold. Beside her sat James Potter. The boy had a thin, white scar on his cheek, a permanent reminder of Severus's power, but it didn't seem to bother him. In fact, he was leaning in close to Lily, whispering something in her ear. Lily laughed, a genuine musical laugh that Severus hadn't heard directed at him in months. She didn't look across the hall. She didn't look for the boy from Spinner's End. Severus watched them, his chest tight, his breathing shallow. The realization settled over him like a heavy, suffocating blanket of ash. He had thought that escaping Tobias Snape and coming to Hogwarts would be enough. He had thought that simply possessing magic would make him worthy in Lily's eyes and intouchable to the world. He was wrong. The world was vicious. It rewarded the wealthy, the arrogant, and the cruel. It favored boys like James Potter, who treated magic like a toy, while discarding boys like Severus, who needed it to survive. To win her back, to crush Potter, and to exact his ultimate revenge on a society that had systematically tried to destroy him since birth, he had to shed his past entirely. He had to embrace the darkness that Lucius Malfoy had seen in him. Severus reached into his bag and pulled out a blank, leather-bound journal he had purchased in Diagon Alley. He set it on the table. He uncapped his inkwell and dipped his quill. He didn't write about the misery of Pennsylvania. He didn't write about his father's fists or his mother's tears. He let the ink touch the parchment, his handwriting sharp, elegant, and entirely merciless. At the top of the very first page he wrote, "This book is the property of the half-blood prince." He stared at the words, the title of his new identity, his declaration of war. He closed the book, his dark eyes fixing one last time on the laughing boy across the hall. "Laugh while you can, Potter," Severus thought, a cold, absolute certainty settling into his bones. "I am the prince, and I will make you all bleed." The feast raged on around him, but Severus Snape was no longer there. The boy from Spinner's End was dead, and from his ashes, the half-blood prince rose to claim his dark and terrible throne. What did you think of this dark American twist on Snape's origins? I need to know, did Snape cross the line with his dark magic, or did James Potter get exactly what he deserved? Comment, crossed the line,